But when she just owned it, what I watched this morning was her team rallied around her.
You are listening to the Authentic Leader Show, episode 66. Today's episode is called Authentically Build Resilience for You and Your Team. It's an interview with organizational resilience expert, it's Jennifer Edgars. This episode is about the critical benefits of resiliency. Welcome to the Authentic Leader Show. The Authentic Leader Show is the podcast about leaders of leaders who others follow because they want to and not because they have to. In my podcast, I ask the questions to decode what makes these leaders of leaders so good at what they do. What are their most powerful insights? What have been the breakthrough moments that took them to the next level? What routines, mindsets, and daily habits do they have to not only get to the top, but to stay there? Is it possible to build resilience not only in yourself, but also on your team? I had the pleasure of meeting and now interviewing Jennifer Edgars, where we talk about having and building resilience. And when I heard how much she focused on authenticity in her work with her clients, I was glad to invite her on the show. Here are some of the highlights that you'll hear in this interview. Jennifer draws a simple diagram that helps illustrate how she defines authenticity. She shares what she means by kitchen English, and I discovered that I was practicing kitchen English and I didn't even realize it. Jennifer shares what she calls 3 characteristics of resiliency and her framework to become more resilient. While it's hard to find one in the wild, she also describes what a perfectly resilient team looks like. Jennifer even turns the tables and asks me a question when we discuss leadership versus authority. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Well, let's just get right to that episode right now. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Looking at your background, I see that you've worked in some very high-level executive roles for some amazing, really Fortune 100 companies that would be household names for anyone that would hear those. I've got to imagine that background has helped you now in your business.
It certainly has. I mean, I don't think you can ever, you do roles like that, and then I don't think you really realize how much they prepare you for, when you finally get to where you want to be, whether it's running your own business or whether it's sort of the next executive role. It's hard to predict how those roles can prepare you. But I always suggest, even people coming out of college, I always suggest try to get in with a big company, because when I look back, that's really, a lot of those are really the reason for why I've been able to do what I've done.
Yeah. As you say that, I can't help but think there are many times in my career where in the moment, either I knew I was learning something and I was going to be able to use this. And other times I questioned, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And now to look back and realize that all of it was for a purpose and for a reason. I use things that I just questioned, why am I doing this? And now I know, and I have that experience behind me.
I think that's great. Even in the bad experiences, right? We learn what not to do. I can't tell you how many of those executive roles taught me what not to do. But I think, that you bring up a really interesting point, which kind of ties into my field of resilience, in that one of the characteristics of resilient people and organizations is the ability to find meaning in a situation. And so the degree to which we can kind of look back and say, even if it's after the fact, what did I learn or what did I get out of that? What can I take away from it? Really helps us in the next space.
One place that I fortunately realized that was even really bad bosses or bad leaders I worked with, I must say, I feel like I almost learned more from them than I did from the really fantastic leaders that I worked for.
Boy, those are painful lessons, though. I tell people that I can honestly say with a straight face, I've worked with 3 of the worst bosses in the world. And I have to say, I learned a lot. That you're exactly right. But boy, I kind of wish maybe there was a different way to learn. But
I know. I know. I've learned also to forgive them because I feel that most of them didn't realize it at the time. They truly were doing their very best with what they knew how to do. I just wish they knew better.
I think No, you're exactly right. It's funny. I ran into one of them, and there's stories about him in the book. And I ran into him at a reunion not long ago. And, he kind of said to me, boy, I think I made your life difficult. And we laughed about it. We were able to have a conversation about it.
You've now had your own business for a decade now after your corporate experience. Mm-hmm. And so I'm fascinated by that. But one thing that we have a shared common focus, which is on authenticity. Mm-hmm. How do you describe authenticity?
Yeah, I very much, we have a little Venn diagram that we use to describe authenticity. And I look at authenticity as, if there's two converging circles, one is the image that you project to the world. So how do others see you? And then the other one is who you really are. And so authenticity is sort of where those circles converge. So it's all about, are you really being the person that you're projecting to the world, or are you projecting the person that you're really being? And I think that becomes the root of a lot of things in leadership. So I was really excited about that. Actually, when I started looking into your podcast and your work, it was really exciting to see that we share that. Because that's, in fact, when we started the business, the name of my company was LeaderShift Authentic Insights. And, eventually I had a marketing person come in and say, it's too long. You got to take out a word. And so we lost the authenticity in the name, but we certainly, it's a concept that's so core to emotional intelligence. It's so core to resilience. It's so core to leadership that it's just something we seem to talk about all the time.
Mm-hmm. That Venn diagram, I've actually seen that. And we many times think about authenticity. How hard can authenticity be? But your Venn diagram actually helps to illustrate it's not necessarily as easy as you might think of on the surface. The difference between the image that we project against who we really are. I know even for me, I speak about this all the time, just like you do, yeah. Right? And it's even hard for me. And I focus on it all the time. Yeah. Do you have maybe an example of maybe a client you've worked with or just some story about how someone has been able to move to become more authentic?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a good one. So I'm working with a woman right now, actually, who is doing a restructuring. And I think organizational restructuring, which we do an awful lot of, is an area where authenticity comes into play probably more than any other that I've seen. And where the rubber meets the road is when a leader stands up and says, there won't be any more changes, or no one's going to be laid off, or, they make these sort of grand generalizations about what's going to happen in a restructuring. And of course, we always say never, right? Don't stand up and say there won't be any more layoffs, because something can happen that's out of your control. And then you look, you kind of are eating crow in front of your team. And so, sure enough, we have one of these situations where, a leader told her team that, and lo and behold, a year later, they're being asked to find cuts. And so, she had to kind of go back and tell the team. So I got involved with her right as this was happening. And she said, Jennifer, what do I do? I'm the one that stood up and said, there's not going to be any more layoffs. And here we are with, 24 more layoffs, whatever it is. And I said, you own it. You just own it. And you say, this was a mistake that you can almost laugh about the fact that you should never say never. And everyone in the room is going to understand being in that situation. And you certainly didn't want there to be. It wasn't your intent, but here we are. The business didn't meet the numbers, and we're in this situation, but we're in the situation together. And if that leader can be transparent and really own it. And I watched it was interesting. I was actually on a call with her team this morning, and I watched the transformation, because last week the conversation was very much, how am I going to tell them? Oh my God, they're going to freak out. They're going to be mad at me. They're going to say that I lied. There was all this concern. And then this week when she went to them and she said, you know what, guys, I'm going to eat crow here. Like, I never should have said never, but here we are, and we didn't meet the numbers, and this is what we're being asked to do. And there's a really good story about the success that they're going to be able to build on with a different structure that's going to solve a whole bunch of problems. But when she just owned it, what I watched this morning was her team rallied around her. And by the end of the call, it wasn't her saying, okay, how are we going to make these changes? It was the team saying, hey, here's where there's going to be angst. Here's what we need to communicate. Here's how we can head it off at the pass. And they were giving her these really good ideas. And what I saw was the team and the leader working together. And they were all in it together. It was this magical, sucky situation, but they sort of found the magic in how they worked together because she was willing to be authentic, and she was kind of willing to roll up her sleeves and say, hey, maybe I screwed up, but we got to figure this out. And I think that's the power of really truly being able to be authentic. And of course, we all have the stories that where a leader didn't do that, and it doesn't work quite as well. But I love the positive stories when it works.
Yeah, I love that transparency and humbleness, and just I got to be honest, right? I made a mistake, almost asking for forgiveness. When you do that in a genuine, authentic way, not to overuse the word, I think that your team typically will give you a lot of grace when they feel it from you, right?
Absolutely. And when you're vulnerable too. Sometimes you have to be really vulnerable to be authentic. And I think that really helps.
Yeah. I often say, I think one of the most powerful phrases that a leader can say is, I need your help.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
right?
yeah. 100%.
Yeah, your team, they want to help you. They want to be there to support you. Don't pretend like you don't need help, because the entire team knows you need it.
Right.
So you may as well ask for help and recognize and acknowledge that you need their help. I love this concept that you've talked about, that is kitchen English. What is that, and why is kitchen English important?
It's interesting, the things that you've picked up on. So, kitchen English is a value that I've had for a lot of years, and we've kind of instilled it in our company and in our consulting work. And I think it started, my career started in sort of big six. Back then it was six consulting. And the large consulting firms are really known for coming in and they sort of speak a different language. They have this, you use words and phrases that people don't normally say, and it sort of confuses companies, and sometimes it causes them to snicker. And so I had a boss, at one point I was working at Bank of America, and I had a boss that there was a lot of consultants that came into this organization, and he placed a high value on what he calls kitchen English. And it's the kind of English that you use at your kitchen table. So if you're trying to explain how to do something to your 80-year-old mother, is she going to be able to understand it? So it's Arthur Anderson, the company I started with many years ago, had a phrase, think straight, talk straight. And that's kind of what kitchen English is all about. It's just, we're not going to come in and speak our own language. We're going to speak your language. We're going to get to know the vernacular, the people that we work with. And we're going to transform ourselves to speak the way you understand, not come in with a different lingo that you have to learn. And I think we've differentiated ourselves quite a bit from some of the larger firms in our ability to do that and just get embedded with our clients. So I think that value of kitchen English allows you the opportunity to really be authentic. I think sometimes the words we use when we're not speaking kitchen English kind of hide what we're really thinking. And I feel like if we share a real value of authenticity, then we have to speak in kitchen English, because we want people to really understand what we're saying. And we want the input from them. We have to get the same back from them so that we can have a two-way dialogue that creates learning for both parties.
I learned this lesson when I was in corporate America. I worked for more than 25 years in corporate Fortune 500, not quite Fortune 100, but Fortune 500 companies at their world headquarters. And I had not realized how much corporate speak I had. When I left, maybe 8 years ago or something like that. And I didn't realize it until I started working with small and medium-sized businesses. And they didn't understand what I was saying, some of the concepts I was saying. And it's exactly as you described. They felt like I was almost trying to say something and maybe try to pull something off on them, right? Where I was just using the corporate speak that I knew. So I've had to change my language to be able to talk with them. Now, I still work with large corporations too. And I appreciate having that experience because I can talk that language too. But you have to make a conscious effort. And I really do think that this whole concept of kitchen English, I'd rather default to that really all the time, even working with large corporations. That's when people truly know exactly what you're talking about.
Communication is all about being understood. So if we're speaking kitchen English, even if it's kind of maybe a dummied down version, I hate to say that, of some of the things we learned in corporate America, at least people will know what we're saying. And because I think sometimes when we're not authentic, people will nod their heads and they act like they agree with us, or they act like they understand, but we don't really know when they don't. So if we speak kitchen English, we have a much better chance that people are going to not miss the message.
That's a reason right there to always be speaking kitchen English right there. You also speak about not only individual resilience, but also organizational resilience. In fact, you actually have a book about how resilience is not about bouncing back. How do you know if you're resilient?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And what's cool about this, and this was some of my first research that I did when I started thinking about this topic, is that the characteristics of resilient people and resilient organizations are the same. So it's the same three characteristics. And so what the implication of that is that if we learn to recognize them, number one, we know when we're being resilient. Number two, we can teach it, and we can teach it the exact same way to individuals and organizations. So the characteristics is pretty simple. There's three. So the first one is having a firm grasp on reality. So this idea that it's not positive or negative, or it's not about optimism, it's about really a pragmatic understanding of what is happening. So that firm grasp on reality is kind of harder than it looks. But the idea is that we really take a hard look at what's going on and acknowledge it. It's, and this notion of, people will say, oh, that's such a pessimistic view. Well, it's not pessimistic. We're talking about a real view. So if we just view the world through rose-colored glasses, we really do damage to our ability to be resilient. So this firm grasp on reality is really important. The second one is our ability to find meaning in a situation. So we talked about that a bit. But the idea is that, when we're going through these really tough situations, one of the number one things that we can do to come out on the other side, energized and elevated by what we've gone through, is to find meaning in whatever that was. So what was the lesson that we can take out of it? Or what was the why did we have to go through it? And we don't always know those right away. But the more we can strive to find meaning in these situations, the more resilient we'll be. And then the third characteristic, and the final one, is all about the ability to improvise. And so we saw that with COVID as we look at, even this pandemic that we're in the middle of. It was almost like in one moment a switch flipped and everyone had to, leave the office and go work from home. And we saw some companies deal with that really effectively, and some really struggled. But those that were able to improvise and figure out how can we stay productive, and how can we perform whatever activities we needed to do virtually or some other way, we figure out how to use available resources, and we improvise in the moment. That's also the sort of the last characteristic of resilient people and organizations.
How do you know when you've gotten a firm grasp of reality, like what's really happening, especially like while you're in the middle of it? I mean, hindsight's 2020. It becomes very clear when you look back, but in the middle of it, how do you recognize it when you're in the moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question too. And it's not easy, but I think part of it, when we're thinking about organizational resilience, I think a lot of it is talking to others and really engaging other people in a dialogue that says, hey, what's really going on here? So let's take out the emotion. Let's take out the worry and the fear and all the static around what's going on. And let's just figure out, what are the facts as we know them today? So if you can just carve out all the static and say, what are the facts? What's really going on here? What's the data that we have? I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. And I think it becomes infinitely easier when you have other people to bounce it off of and really share in that conversation.
Yeah, I hear you talking about finding the objective data where you can, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's always objective data, but we can certainly find it where you can, I think is a good way to say it.
How can someone become resilient? I mean, if you feel like you're not resilient, how do you become resilient?
Yeah, that's So there's a framework that we published in the book that has it's almost like a checklist, but it's a graphic that has sort of two cubes sitting on a flat space. And so they're really, when we look at the elements of the framework, you can kind of use them as a checklist. So the framework contains your mindset, the choices that you make, And those two things are sitting on this bedrock, which is your core beliefs. So if someone's trying to become resilient, it's really working on those three things. So the first and the foremost is your core beliefs. And, this is a weird one because when we go into a corporate workshop, people aren't used to being asked, what are your core beliefs? And so sometimes individually, that's your faith. That's your, what do you believe about where the flowers grow and what's true for you about life in the world and, higher power and all that stuff. But it doesn't really matter. And as a program leader, it doesn't really matter to me what you believe. What matters to me is that you know what you believe. So this notion of, first step in becoming resilient is to really get clear on what are your core beliefs. Now, if you were a company coming to me saying we want to become more resilient, it's the same exact question, but we probably use different words in a company. So I might say, instead of core beliefs, I might say, what are your core values? Or what is your mission statement or your purpose statement? Things like that. So, and it may not be your statement. It may be what really is your purpose. What's the why that people rally around? So these things translate from individual to organizational, but the first one is always your core beliefs. The second one is your mindset. And your mindset is made up of your attitude, and you choose your attitude in every moment of every day, and your authenticity. So attitude and authenticity are the keys to a resilient mindset. And what I like to say about that is that you have a choice in every situation to be who you really are. And so, people say to me, well, how do I know if I'm being authentic? Well, we have the Venn diagram, but at the end of the day, you get to choose who you really are in every moment. And so making those choices is the second piece of resilience, right? So we want those choices to be made in accordance with some sense of purpose. And that may be a purpose for the situation itself. And then the other piece is your definition of success. So if you really want to build resilience, and the book is divided into two parts. So the first part is how do you become a more resilient individual? The second part is how do I take what I just learned and apply it to my team or my organization? So I recommend using that framework like a checklist. Some people are going to be naturally authentic, but maybe their mindset could use some help. So we have some tools and some, real detailed information that you can go through and pick the areas where you need the most work. And you can do the same exercise with your team and say, okay, these are areas where, we know we need to double down a little bit and spend some time working on it.
What would you say is maybe a critical skill that leaders need to build authenticity?
Usually when I'm asked the question of what's the number one skill leaders need, I think my answer to that is always resilience, because I think resilience buys you an awful lot in a leadership role. And one of the things so on one hand, being authentic is a huge component of becoming resilient. On the other hand, when you are resilient, it is also a lot easier to be authentic because resilient people, it's sort of a nested set. Resilient people have a much greater confidence that it's safe to be authentic. And I think that confidence is the confidence that comes from resilience is a big piece that drives authenticity. It's kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg.
I think something along those lines, you mentioned the word confidence. I've had people ask, I'm just not confident. How do you create confidence when I don't feel like I have confidence? Do you have an answer for that? How do people create confidence?
Yeah, practice. And I would say, the other thing I would say is, I think a lot of times emerging leaders in particular, or leaders that haven't thought a lot about the way they lead, one of the things you have to realize is who you are as a person drives who you are as a leader. And so that's really the crux, I think, of a lot of the work that we do. Okay, so I think confidence comes with, in a lot of ways, allowing yourself to be a bit vulnerable and then seeing what it does for you. So a lot of times what we find is that people who aren't confident aren't willing to be vulnerable. So they're not willing to be transparent. They often come across as unauthentic or inauthentic because they don't have confidence. But I would say try it on. Start small. I think this stuff, when I think about how long does it take to master some of this stuff, it's probably as long as it does to master a good game of tennis. But I think you have to start small. I wouldn't start with, the big, massive issue that is going to completely ruin you if you handle it wrong. You start with the small issues and show a little vulnerability, show a little transparency, try to be authentic, and gauge the response. And if you're really intentional about doing that, you'll build that confidence. I think, I think that's really important.
How do you know if your team is resilient? And if they aren't, as a leader, what can you do?
A resilient team, and we don't see very many of these. So I'll be honest, there's not a ton of case studies on this. But what we do see when a team is resilient is that even if the boss isn't in the room or the leader's not there, they're making decisions that are in alignment with their purpose. There's no internal competition. There's no debate over where resources go. There's no hidden agendas. It's like a crisis hits and they just dive in with, even maybe without the meeting, right? They just dive in and they all know what to do, and they're all kind of running on the same page, running in the same direction. And when we've seen examples of this, it's absolutely amazing to watch, because a team can go from a major crisis to a complete plan and moving past it really quickly if they've done the intentional preparation ahead of time to be resilient. If they haven't, what we see is this infighting. We see a lot of hidden agendas. We see people not getting along. I mean, those are usually when we get called to do a hash out session, right? Team wants to hash it out because no one's getting along. Well, they're not getting along because they haven't done the intentional work to figure out how to get on the same page and really how to move in the same direction with a shared agenda and shared priorities. And that's a lot of the first step when we think about building team resilience. That alignment is the first step.
Yeah, you did a great job really describing what a resilient team is. And I would go so far as to say that is also a certain level of maturity in that team. I agree with you. It's uncommon, but anyone who is leading a team, it's almost like that's the picture of where to take the team. Like that's the ultimate destination, is to have a team that runs so autonomously and everyone just simply knows what to do. The leader's there almost as a cheerleader, if anything, but doesn't necessarily have to be there for them to do what needs to be done.
Yeah, we work a lot with the notion of adaptive leadership, which is a bit of a different leadership style. It's not hierarchical. It's more about how do we deal with these really complex challenges that require us to kind of gain the hearts and minds of people in these more complex situations. And one of the big pieces is this difference between leadership and authority. And I think leaders that are really resilient know when to step back and let the team lead. But I'm curious what you see in that area. I mean, you're in the thick of this too. I'm really curious. How would you describe a resilient team?
Well,
I turn it around.
Yeah, no, I love that. The difference between leadership and authority. And many times I'll ask with the clients I work with and the teams I work with, which one is better? Is it to be a manager or to be a leader? Yeah. But I typically start off with, this is a trick question. No one picks up on that part of it because it is a trick question. Right. And neither one is more important or better. What's important is knowing when to be a manager and when to be a leader, which is kind of, as you described, being a leader and using your authority. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of making decisions with the team and getting everyone on board and everyone is stacking hands. Sometimes a manager needs to come in with the manager hat on and say, hey, I'm using my authority. I need to make a decision. I'm going to own the decision. If it's a bad decision, I'm also going to own the bad decision. But when necessary, or really when possible, and I think it's more possible than people think lots of times, I think you need to be a leader, right? And bring the team along in that decision. And even if you can't, at least share with the team how you came to your decision and why you think this is the best one. But I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. I hope I don't often get the table turned.
That was great.
Is there anything that we have not covered that you want to make sure this audience hears before we move on?
I would just share one thing that I think is interesting is that, so there's a guy at Harvard, he's a professor, Bob Keegan, and he wrote a book called An Everyone Culture not long ago. And it's really interesting. He did some fascinating research. And one of the things that he said is that, you kind of have a sense of how much you're working, like how many hours a day you're working. If you're in a corporation, you're not working 8 hours a day, right? You're working a lot more than that. But what he's saying is that for every person, they're actually doing 2 full-time jobs. So just imagine like your full-time job and how long that takes. He's saying that for every's probably, probably a superlative, but for people in corporate America, they're actually, most of them are doing 2 full-time jobs. And the other full-time job is managing the politics and the inauthenticity that's going on in corporations. So there's all this sort of static and noise that people have about protecting their image. And so this notion of managing image has become a second full-time job for people. And I think if we want to start building resilient companies and resilient organizations, we have to eliminate that. We have to give people the freedom to really be authentic without having to spend all this time managing their image and dealing with internal politics and all of this sort of things that make us feel unsafe. And the reason for that is that when we're dealing with these complex challenges that we've never seen before, we need every ounce of discretionary effort that people have. There's no margin anymore. There's no ability to we don't have all these extra people lying around that we can, when we get into a crisis, we can call on. It's the same people that are there today. So if they're not spending all this time managing image, they can put all that energy on helping you get through your crisis. So to me, that really is an eye-opening piece of resilience too, is minimizing this time spent in image.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I've seen this time and again, especially in large organizations, the whole politics and inauthenticity, a lot of ego, people trying to protect their brand, if you will. Mm-hmm. Just so much energy, not only for those people who are doing that, but for everyone else who's managing, working
right.
with that as well. And I think it speaks a lot to the culture that has been established and supported by leaders. So what's the ultimate goal of any organization is to be as efficient and productive as possible. And this is absolutely a handicap that is put on large organizations by allowing this to happen. This certainly is not easy, especially for an organization that has this rampant in organizations. And like I say, I think the larger the organization is, the more likely and the more difficult this type of culture is. But it's an important thing. Let's not put our heads in the sand and say, oh, we can't do anything about it. No, the top leaders in the organization need to recognize it and do something about it. This is such an important point. What is a book that has maybe had the most influence on you, or even a book that you're reading right now?
I think In Everyone Culture was huge for me. I mean, that was a really good book, the Bob Keegan book. I'm not going to say it's the easiest read in the world, but it is probably one of the easier reads of his. But that's a really good one. The other one I really like that I use. So there's 2 books that I use with almost every client, and one of them is Leadership on the Line by Ron Heifetz, and he's sort of the adaptive leadership guru. And so that that book really explains how, when leaders are leading in a difficult situation, you really have a target on your head. So the idea is, how do you dole out change at a pace people can handle without getting assassinated? And so it comes from the Kennedy School of Government. So assassination may mean something slightly different to them than it does to those of us in corporate America. But I think the points are very valid, and it really resonated with me. And then there's another guy that took that concept and really embedded it deeper into corporations. And he taught it. So the book is called Adaptive Capacity, and it's by one Carlos Eichholz. And he talks quite a bit about how do we help organizations increase their capacity to adapt, which I think speaks pretty directly to resilience as well. He doesn't call it that, but when I think about who I quote, in my book, and so who I've read and who's influenced me, I would say those 2 are right up there.
What is authentic success to you?
Wow. I think that's probably my personal definition of that. I feel like I know that when I'm being true to myself and I'm successful, I feel like that's authentic success, right? I was very successful working in Manhattan when I started my career, dog eat dog, crazy, New York life. It wasn't me. Right. So it was very successful. I was very successful, but it wasn't rewarding in the least, but when I left Manhattan, the pace slowed down a little bit, and I was able to really do business, I think, more in line with my values. And that's not to say there's nothing wrong with Manhattan, and I have many clients in New York. I don't want to badmouth anybody, but the environment there was much less me than the way I choose to run my business. I think, and part of that might have just been leaving the big consulting world and being able to really do consulting differently. But I think when it's really aligned to your values and you're able to do those things that you're really good at, and it's kind of like being able to sort of show off your superpower. Those are really authentic times, and those are fun. But when you have to be somebody else to be successful, or be someone that isn't really what you stand for, it's very difficult.
I love that. I may steal that, showing off your superpower. We all have one, right?
You have one, right?
What does it mean for a leader to be authentic?
Oh, I think I have to go back to just, it's when who you really are is in fact the image that you project to the world.
To describe it any better than that, I wouldn't expect any different answer from you, actually, than that one. For people who would like to learn more about you and would like to maybe even follow you, what's the best way for people to reach you and to follow what you do?
Sure. Our website, first of all, www.leadershift.insights.com. Certainly there's a blog there. I do a lot of writing in our blog. So there's a blog there you can subscribe to. You could follow me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I think LinkedIn is probably where I'm the most active. But yeah, by all means. And certainly, check out the book, and by all means, and it's on the website. If you just look under our knowledge base, you'll see the link for the Resilience book. And we're, more than happy to get that to you. And then, if anybody wants to talk about this concept further, I'm pretty reachable, actually. So we have a contact form on the website. Our phone number's all over the website. That stuff all finds its way to me. So we certainly have a team that, will go through that. But most of those conversations eventually get to me. So would love to entertain, further conversations if any of your listeners would like to do that.
Well, Jennifer, I got to tell you, I've very much enjoyed this conversation with a fellow authenticity speaker and content expert. Thank you for making time to talk with us today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. This was fun. It was really, it is always great to find a kindred spirit that's working in the same space. So really enjoyed it as well.
What did you think of that interview? We talked about the critical skill of leaders to build resiliency. I think the need to build resiliency applies to everyone for two reasons. Number one, I believe that everyone is a leader. Even if someone doesn't believe that they are a leader, they are, because everyone has some level of influence. And leadership is influence. But that's a topic for another day. But number two is also, if anyone is going to build success in their life, having resiliency is a part of the game of life. So the more resilient you are, the more effective you'll be at creating success. To be resilient is to have the capacity to bounce back after overcoming adversity or a setback. An obvious example is that we can all appreciate that there are celebrities who have fallen from their stardom. Some have been involved in a scandal or made a poor professional decision. In these cases, the fall can be really hard and fast. One minute you're a household name, the next minute you fall into disgrace and no one wants anything to do with you. Now, I don't run in the celebrity circles. I bet most of you listening to this podcast are unlikely to have the high-profile experience that celebrities have. But we all experience unexpected obstacles. If we just sit there and don't take action, we're going to stay there or even fall behind. I know people who are having a tough time after the pandemic hit and now during the pandemic. They're struggling to find their way and what their future holds. In some cases, maybe they lost their job, or they see a different future for themselves now, or they have finally decided that they need to change their course to a clear definition of success, or their businesses had to change how they operate. I've seen this happen right in front of me with people who I know who are national speakers, and their entire business revolves around traveling to conferences and corporate events to deliver keynote addresses. When the pandemic hit, these public events dried up. Many had to shift to a new plan, a new way to think about their business, and a new way to serve their audience. Unfortunately, some of these national speakers aren't making a transition to anything else, and they're really struggling. Although a large part of my business has been speaking at events, I was glad that other areas of my business have continued. Like, I'm still providing online coaching services to my clients. And of course, I still produce this weekly podcast. But getting together in groups and delivering training programs or speaking at events, it's a while off before that's going to happen again. So I rethought my business and how I can serve my audience. I've been creating and now delivering online video programs for my clients to distribute to their internal teams, where normally I would have just delivered those same training programs in person at their office. And I've also created an online course when I would have normally offered this course live and as a public event. You may need to rethink how you will serve in the future. And that's actually the intention of my online course. I help people who have decided that they need to do things differently and finally establish a system of success for themselves. Now, if that's you, check out AuthenticSuccessOnline.com and see how this course it may work for you. You can join others who have made the commitment to develop a plan that fits them. Just check out AuthenticSuccessOnline.com and see for yourself. You can find the links to the resources mentioned in this episode on the show notes page. You can find the show notes at ChristopherRJones.com/066 for episode 66. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and, well, really any podcast app. You can also leave us a rating and review on podcast apps like Apple Podcasts. I know that you have a lot of options to choose from to put into your ears and listen to. I sincerely thank you for being a listener of this podcast. Please let us know in the comments what you think of today's episode, and please come back for another episode. It's faithful listeners like you who make this podcast possible. Well, that's all for this week. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, remember, you don't need to be a leader of leaders. Just be the leader others want to follow. Be an authentic leader.